This is my country, my damn country.
Ladies and gentlemen, JustIn Lithuania, and we're talking to a writer and a correspondent for 30 years, an expert in Russian and Eastern European affairs. Among his books are Spycraft Rebooted, the Deception, the Snowden Operation, and the latest book is called Cyberphobia. Ladies and gentlemen, Edward Lucas, welcome to the show, sir.
Nice to be here.
Sveiki atvykę sugrįžę į Lietuvą.
Labai ačiū, man labai patinka būt pas jūs čia. Naujas televizijos, Liberty TV. Kaip lietuviškai Liberty? Laisvės TV?
Laisvės televizija.
Laisvės televizijos. Yeah,
wow. You mastered Lithuanian language pretty good.
Ja, aš buvau korespondentas čia nie labai ilgai, bet buvo pakankama.
Yeah, and the interesting story is that you were the first recipient of a Lithuanian visa after we got our independence back. It was what?
Before.
17 days after we got our independence. Yeah. Yours was the first one.
Nulis vienas. Yeah, I remember it like yesterday.
Right, so you were appointed to Lithuania to cover the Eastern European independence movement. When was your first time to Lithuania?
I came the first time in January 1990, and I was a correspondent for The Independent, which in those days was a very big British paper. And we had 9 correspondents just in this region, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Bulgaria, Yugoslavia, Vienna, and 3 covering the Soviet Union, as it was then. But Czechoslovakia, which I'd been covering during the revolution, had got a bit quiet because Havel was president. We were in the sort of clear-up phase. And so the then foreign editor, Nick Ashford, said, go and do a trip to the Baltic States. Take 10 days, fly to Vilnius, and then go to Latvia, Estonia, and then come out to Finland and just write 3 big pieces, big features. And so I did that, and it was just before Gorbachev was going to come here, so it was sort of the run-up to the Gorbachev visit, and I tried to explain a bit about Lithuania to a British audience that didn't know so much. And it was pretty difficult. I went to the Lithuanian Foreign Ministry, the Lithuanian SSR Foreign Ministry, and said, would it be possible to come and live here as an accredited correspondent? This was a big question for them. But anyway, I left that thought with them, and then I came back when you declared independence in March 1990. I thought, why don't I just try and go there?
And it so happened that you lived in Lithuania till 1994?
Yeah, on and off. After I got in, the KGB called in our Moscow correspondent and said, either Mr. Lucas goes or you do.
Oh, really?
And so I had to leave, and it was difficult getting in, but it was even more difficult getting out because I absolutely refused. They wanted me to go to the OVR in Moscow and regularize my status there, and I wasn't going to do that. So I tried to cross the Lithuanian-Polish border, but I couldn't do that because that was under Soviet control. It was only for Lithuanian and Polish people. And so I took a taxi to Grodno and went into the KGB headquarters in Grodno and said, I'm here illegally. I want you to deport me.
Wow. What was their reaction?
It was not a standard request, I think.
Well, absolutely. What was their initial reaction when you just walked in with that kind of statement?
Молодой человек, где ваш виза? Как вы туда попались? Ну, вы знаете, я английский корреспондент. Я был в Литве, но я хочу дома. And they couldn't really understand this. They hadn't really understood that Lithuania was independent, and they kept on saying, how did you get in? And I said I was allowed in by the Lithuanian, I was given a Lithuanian visa. Что такое? And but in the end, they said, you'll never come back to the Soviet Union. That was their big thing. You're deported. You're never, ever going to get a Soviet visa again.
Well, and they were right. You never did come back to Soviet Union.
On the contrary, I came back 2 months later, but with a different passport, which outwitted them. And having dropped my middle name, which confused. So I got a visa to Estonia in the summer of 1990 to attend, issued by the Writers' Union, to attend a literary festival. And once I was in Estonia, I then changed this visa to be valid for the entire Soviet Union. And I stayed for about another four months, mainly living in Lithuania, but traveling up and down in the Baltics. And then I went to Washington for a bit, and then I came back just after August, just after independence was finally achieved, and then I stayed for another, basically until the September 1994.
What were your first impressions about the independent Lithuania?
I think my clearest memory is going into the KGB headquarters, which had just been taken over by the Lithuanians, and there was a Soviet official there. I think his name was Kaplan, and we interviewed him, and he was there to try and sort of manage the handover. And in the basement, there was a big pile of pistols. These were all the pistols for every KGB officer in Lithuania had to hand over their pistol. There was just a big pile of pistols on the floor. That was very impressive.
Wow. The whole thing, it's the independence and from the Soviet Union, and then the political situation after that. We had what it's called the Eastern European post-stress disorder, where we tried to warn the world, the Western world, that you should beware of Russia, and everyone was just like, calm down. We need to keep things calm and steady in relationship to Russia. How did that work out?
Well, I think it's not quite my memory of it. I think that there was a pretty clear recognition in the West that we needed to get the remaining Soviet troops out of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. And this was quite a big deal. But I remember President Clinton coming here in 94, and I asked him at a press conference, and maybe it was even 93 or 92, but I was pushing quite hard. And I think there was quite a consensus in the West that these troops had got to go, when the Russians said, well, we need to leave them behind as guarantors of the so-called Russian-speaking minority. That didn't really go very far. So I think that was... But then after 94, then the question became, are these countries candidates for the EU and maybe even NATO? And that took some time. And I think that one of the conditions for getting in was not making a fuss about Russia. It didn't help. I mean, privately, Estonians, Latvians, Lithuanians, Ukrainians, even Russians would say, watch out, Russia's going in the wrong direction. And there were some speeches. So the Estonian President Lennart Meri gave a very good speech about Russia in 94. Professor Landsbergis gave some speeches. But there was a kind of understanding of, we will consider, or in order to be seen as suitable for NATO, shut up about Russia. And I think that was carried on until you actually joined NATO. But you're absolutely right. The warnings were given, and the West didn't listen. And if we had listened back in the 90s, I think we'd be in a safer place now.
Where do you think was the election of Putin, Putin's coming to power, was it the turning point of Russia? Or was it...
No, I think that's a misunderstanding. I think the problems predate Putin, and the problems will continue after Putin. Putin is a symptom, fundamentally, of things that are wrong in Russia, both the ascendance of the old power structures, which started with, I would say, with Kozhakov, who was head of Yeltsin's bodyguard, Primakov, who was head of the Foreign Intelligence Service, but this FSBificatia of Russia certainly predated Putin. Also the overlap between state structures, business, and organized crime, which is very characteristic of the Putin regime. This was already flourishing, this sort of hybrid creation in St. Petersburg was flourishing in the 1990s. But I think Putin was, and when Putin first came in, the West liked him. Yeah, I was sounding the alarm. I was saying, this is very bad. This is an ex-KGB guy who sees the fall of the Soviet Union as the geopolitical catastrophe of the last century. We should be not pleased about this. But many Westerners were pleased because they said it's stable, the economy will boom, and so on.
Well, they were probably pleased because he took care of some of the oligarchs that, well, later we found out that they weren't suitable for him. And as we know from Mr. Browder's story, well, at first he writes in his red notice that at first Putin looked like to be a nice guy that takes care of the corruption with a strong hand, and later he found out that, well, it was all in his self-interest.
I think that Bill Browder is an ally of mine, and I commend the work he's done on the Magnitsky front. But he was a big cheerleader for Putin. And,
oh yeah, at first.
And he, and I think that the idea that Putin was, first of all, the oligarchs were quite popular in the West because their companies were quoted and people had lent them money. So there was no, people like Berezovsky had been very useful, not least to Britain, in getting hostages out of Chechnya and so on. When Putin started going after the oligarchs, the Khodorkovsky empire, I think, was $8 billion of Western shareholders' money disappeared when the Khodorkovsky empire was. Now, I personally think that was the right thing to do, was to go after Khodorkovsky and all these oligarchs, because they basically had not really created value, they'd stolen it. What wasn't right was that they were replaced by another class of oligarchs. So you get rid of Khodorkovsky and instead you have Mr. Sechin, who's, I think, even worse. And some oligarchs, like Deripaska, for example, just survived all the way through. But I think the West was always very confused about this, because on the one hand, we were worried about our investments. On the other hand, we had this hope that this was a move towards a more better developed, more law-abiding Russia. But of course it wasn't, and all those hopes were delusions. But I disagree with Bill Browder, who saw he was far too soft on Putin at the beginning, and I think he would admit that, if not publicly, at least privately.
Well, absolutely, because at first he saw that, he saw that some of the companies that were mismanaged and were, managed by thieves, by oligarch criminals, he took care of them, and he probably got the impression that, okay, so now we got someone honest in the government. And I guess he was just wrong about that.
I think there were some important reforms, particularly when Andrei Illarionov was still the economic advisor to Putin, and you had reforms on flat tax. He changed the tax system, that was good. You had a land reform, allowing full private ownership of land and a cadastre and things like that. So there were some sort of important structural economic reforms, and also the macroeconomic situation stabilized, so we didn't have this sort of crazy Chernomyrdin approach of just paying bills by printing money. And those were, I think, ultimately of quite of significance in creating and although we can be critical of Putin, we should be critical, we must remember this is the 19 years he's been in power is the only period in Russian history when you've had 19 years of rising living standards, political stability, and personal freedom. And if you're Russian, that's a big deal.
Absolutely. That's why he gets his ratings. Were you, when he was replaced by Mr. Medvedev, were you excited about that? Because,
no, it was.
Medvedev looked like, he listens to Deep Purple, he's into internet, he's like, a fun guy, maybe even, he's going to change something.
I think what in Russian is called the rokirovka was a cynical political tactic, and it was of no significance about Russia's long-term development, and the West largely fell for it. This was the era of the reset as well, when the Americans said, well, let's pretend that Medvedev is a serious political figure, and he's not.
He appeared to be, though.
Well, to some people, but only if they were stupid.
Okay. You didn't fall for it?
No, absolutely not. Read my book.
Okay. How dangerous is it to have Putin, who seems to be, getting a bit desperate right now? to the Western world?
I think there's always the danger of unpredictability, and we see there's quite a clear sort of political mechanism in Russia that when things are going badly at home, Putin tries to do something abroad. And we've seen this with the war in Georgia, the war in Ukraine, the war in Syria, and on the whole, foreign policy stunts coincide with domestic political difficulties. And I think that it's clear that the political situation is difficult for Putin right now. These popularities dropping, Russians are fed up, particularly the urban, educated Russians who see through, I think, to some extent, all this propaganda stuff. And so I think we should expect he will do something. I don't think that he will do a direct attack on a NATO or EU country. I think it's more likely we see something in Belarus. And it probably will be ultimately of not very long-term significance. You need something that looks good on telly and doesn't cost very much, and preferably something that's not too risky. So if I had to bet, I would say that we'll see a bit more attention on the Union State. This will be bigged up, the idea of the Union State, and this also solves the problem of what he does when his presidential term expires, that he can become head of the Union State. I don't think it will necessarily mean toppling Lukashenko. I don't think it will change the way things work in Belarus, but this would be quite an easy option for him to do. There's also the possibility of tightening the squeeze on Ukraine with the blockade of Mariupol and the Sea of Azov. That's a possibility. And we shouldn't forget Kazakhstan, where we've just seen a change in Nazarbayev is stepping down, and maybe Russia would try and exert some influence there. But I think the big point is that Russia is still able to take the initiative on foreign policy, and then we react. I wish it was the other way around.
We just recently had some big talks about the reparations of the occupation of Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia. What is your take on that?
I think I can understand why people want this, because you suffered enormous losses of people and of cultural and physical capital under the occupation. I don't think you're going to get anywhere, and I'm not sure it's where I would be concentrating my political energies. I think the most important thing is to make these countries into tremendous success stories where the people who've emigrated want to come home, the people who live here are proud to live here, where you have excellent public services, strong economy, high levels of social trust and cohesion. And I think that looking backwards to the events of the decades of the Soviet occupation is not necessarily, I can see why you do it. I wouldn't make it a top priority.
Yeah, but I guess people just want an apology.
Yes, I can see that would be, and it's baffling to me that Russia won't do that, and this continuing attempt to cast doubt on the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact or to justify it, to say this was the justified response to Western diplomatic aggression or the failure of other countries to confront Hitler. I think that's deplorable, and I think it's right to carry on pushing on that, and I think it's very good that we have here in Lithuania the Sakharov Center, where we are in Kaunas, which I was just visiting yesterday, and I think it's very important to keep alive this spirit of critical, free-thinking Russian approaches to both to the past and to the present. I would love to see more Russian history being taught to Russians by Russians outside Russia. I think this is very important. You can't teach history properly inside Russia, but you can teach history outside Russia. And I spend a lot of my time raising money and trying to do things so that Russians can look at these questions and come to their own conclusions, hopefully better ones than the Putin regime does.
How real is a possibility of cyber war?
Well, it's going on all the time. I mean, I think war isn't the right framework, because a war has a clear beginning and a clear end. At the end of a war, you know who won and who lost. usually. So I think the cyber is part of the competition between states, and it has many different dimensions. There's the espionage dimension, the sabotage, which is both actual sabotage and potential sabotage, so being in the position where you can disrupt another country's critical infrastructure, which may be more important than actually doing it. Once you do it, then the other country knows what you've done and they can take steps against it. If you just make them think you can do it, that can be a method of intimidation. There's also the whole criminal side, which is very big in Russia, of stealing things, stealing intellectual property, which is industrial espionage, also just stealing money, which the North Koreans do very effectively. So I think that we need to take, I think this cyber is part of the sort of the next generation threats, both in terms of deterrence and in terms of resilience and understanding what other countries can do. And I don't think we are anywhere near where we should be in terms of being able to counter it.
Are we, as a society, aware of the dangers that are there?
I think it depends which country, and different countries have different vulnerabilities. I think in Britain there's a lot of focus on the epidemic of petty crime being perpetrated over the internet, which is basically old-fashioned scams and confidence tricks, but it's done by
Nigerian prince.
It's the modern version of the Nigerian prince. Of get on, we owe you some money. Get onto your online banking. Read what you see on the screen. Thanks very much. You think you're getting a refund, but actually I've just taken all your money.
Oh, is that the newest?
It's one of them. But I mean, or it's people phoning up and saying, "I'm phoning from the tax authorities. You owe us money. We're coming to take your house away or close your business." Another one is saying, we're going to cut your internet off unless you pay the bill right now. Sometimes it's offering...
And they send you the new account?
They send you an account number, yeah. Or it's invoice fraud, where you're expecting to pay your builder, and then you get an email, it seems to be from your builder, saying, "Hi, it's builder here, but we've changed our bank account. Can you pay this to this account instead?" People always fall for that one. So people are very aware of this, and I'm constantly beating up our government about it and beating up the banks about it, because fundamentally this works only because of weaknesses in the system, and we could plug those weaknesses.
Well, in Lithuania, we still have the old-fashioned scamming when they call someone in the middle of the night and they tell you that it's your son, and I got into an accident and I have to pay the bribe, and then this guy will come over and pick up the money.
Yes.
And a lot of old ladies fall for that. And the biggest story in Lithuania was when a lady took the money to the guy because her son was in an accident, and he needed the money to pay off someone who got into an accident. And after she gave them the money, she realized that, well, she doesn't have a son, and that really happened. What are the other scams that are, well, because I guess we don't have a lot of internet scamming here in Lithuania. Well, what are the ones that we should be aware of?
Well, I think the thing, it's not exactly a scam, but I think coming down the road towards us are next generation threats on the internet, which we are not aware of. Or one of them is deepfakes, the ability to create audio and video material that looks completely authentic, but is actually just created on a computer. And we're familiar with this with CGI, which we see in Hollywood films, but this has been a very expensive and difficult process.
How do you mean?
With CGI, computer?
No, the generated video content.
If you Google deepfakes, you'll see examples, but one classic one is where President Obama appears on your screen and he's giving a speech that was actually made by somebody else. I think he's giving a speech by Donald Trump, but it's in Obama's voice.
Okay.
And these are called, and this has been around for some time, but the capability is rapidly becoming cheaper, so you no longer need enormous computers, lots of money and lots of time. You can do it on an Apple Mac with software you can basically get for free. And the quality of these fakes is getting better all the time. And this creates real problems, because you can make a politician say anything, you can make a commanding officer say something, you can make any public figure say or indeed do anything. So as always in the internet, porn is the big driver. So the first deep fakes were pornographic material with the faces of famous people on them. And this was where the most money was to be made in the beginning. But now the same technology can be used for It's no different from many people have these apps on their phone for still pictures. I can take a picture of you and I can make you smile, I can make you look cross, I can make you have things coming out of your head. We're all familiar with this with still pictures, but now you can do it with moving pictures and with audio.
All right, yeah, I can see how it...
And this is a very serious threat to our, the whole basis of how we make up our minds about what we see on our screens. An even bigger problem, I think, is the use of AI and machine learning in politics. So we're used at the moment to having the idea that someone during an election, maybe they ring your doorbell and talk to you, and maybe they phone you up. But imagine you have armies of robots campaigning, robot activists phoning people up, and it sounds just like a real person, or texting you, and it seems to be just like one of your friends texting you, but it's all done by... So this gives a big advantage to people who've got money and technical capability rather than what should be the advantage of can you get activists to come and help with your campaign. So I worry about that a lot. I'm also worried about super doxing, which I think is a huge threat, and we're just beginning to see that coming up as well.
And that is?
So, doxing is when you expose, it's a sort of targeted attack on someone on the internet. But this can be done with much more, at the moment it's really just Googling stuff about people, maybe hacking a bit into their emails and trying to embarrass them. But super doxing is where you have the full weight of a serious intelligence service, and you are hacking into people's phones, getting intimate video and audio of their private lives, getting messages from their, and then putting all that out. And it's a very good way of intimidating people. We saw one example of this with Jessica Aro, the Finnish journalist, who'd investigated the troll factory in St. Petersburg. And the Russians really went after her, getting every bit of information about her private life and trying to make out that she was kind of crazy and disreputable. And this is going to be used a lot in future against individuals.
And you can not only public shame people, because I guess you could get them to do stuff, well, like blackmail them, like this thing will get out if you don't do this and that.
Yeah. So anyway, I mean, those are just three. There's a lot of these next generation threats coming, and I think we are, both in terms of resilience, in terms of particularly soft target protection, in terms of deterrence, we're still playing catch up.
Are the elections under threat in terms of Baltic states? Should we worry? Because apparently they did that in America, and that's, I guess, harder. But what are the threats in Lithuania?
Well, I think on the whole, I would say that Lithuania is admirably resilient on this. I don't regard Lithuania as a frontline state at all. I think you are part of the kind of core, wide-awake, threat-aware, resilient group of countries. I'm much more worried about places like Germany, Italy, actually the United States, where we have a track record of successful Russian interference in elections. I'm worried about my own country. I think it's important to remember that democracy is more than just what happens at elections. And you can kind of harden an election. You can say these are the rules on political speech, these are the rules on political messaging, on advertising. You have a clear number of candidates, you have a point of purchase, you can say to the candidate, this is happening, it's supporting your campaign, it's illegal, what are you doing about it? So I'm in a way less worried about elections than I'm about what happens outside elections. The sort of general political, what Russia is extremely good at is playing on tensions and divisions in society, whether they're ethnic, demographic, regional, linguistic, cultural, economic, social, any kind of division or tension. The Russians will try and exploit it because it weakens social cohesion, which makes it easier to influence the society. And that mostly happens outside election times, and I think that's a bigger threat.
When we're talking about the threats that Russia poses for our society, if we're talking enough about those threats, is it just me or there is a threat of Russophobia in our own society? Because it's sometimes hard to differentiate, like, the Russian government and the Russian people.
Well, I think that's a very good question on two levels. I think, first of all, you're quite right that it's important we don't lump all Russians together with the Kremlin. The Kremlin is our enemy. The SVR, the GRU, the power ministries, the Siloviki, the regime, they are doing bad things to us. They're also doing bad things to Russia. And in a way, the Russians are the greatest victims of this. If you look at what's happened to Lithuania, I remember in 1990, big demonstration in Moscow, and there were the great Russian Democrats, Starovoitova and Kovalyov and the others, and they said to their Baltic friends, they were demonstrating on behalf of freedom in the Baltic states, and they said, let's build democracy together. Давайте построим вместе демократию. And the Balts said, no, let's do it separately. And that was the right answer, because look what you've done in the last 30 years, and look what they've done. The Russians are basically citizens of a backward pariah state, isolated from world culture, feared, not respected. It's a pretty bad outcome, actually, compared with what they could have done. So let's make sure we stay friends with the Russians while we keep up our very critical approach to the regime. But Russophobia is a very interesting word, because phobia means fear as well as hatred, and often irrational fear. And I think you're absolutely right. There's a danger that we overdo our concern about Putin. We demonize him. We make him out to be some kind of mythical figure with supernatural powers, the Voldemort, the Sauron.
Because he kind of looks like, in the public eye,
but he's not. He's
all-powerful.
He's not. He's a jerk.
He is.
He's a jerk. He's a second-rate, third-rate intelligence officer who never did anything in his intelligence career. He was pretty unsuccessful in his St. Petersburg job. He lucked out because he was loyal, got the top job, and he's got some skills in balancing the different factions and going on telly and making the Russians feel good about what's happening. But he's not Superman. And I think and particularly after the Russian influence operations had some success in big Western countries, Macron leaks in France, different things in Germany, Brexit in Britain, Trump campaign or Hillary campaign in America. People overstate Russian influence. And I'm always saying to them, don't get this in proportion, guys. The Russian economy is the size of the Italian economy. The Russian defense budget is smaller than the combined defense budgets of Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Sweden, Norway, Finland, Denmark, and Poland, and Iceland. Just those 8 or 9 countries around the Baltic Sea spend more on defense than Russia does. So let's not big up the Russian threat. Let's not give Putin more power more influence than he actually has.
You're absolutely right, but then you see Putin, and he's out there with his new guns and the new nuclear technologies, and he's like, well, now we can get the targets in deep America, and then, well, he spreads fear. So,
well, we shouldn't fall for this. This is his sort of, this is a Putin PR campaign. Yes, he's got some modern weapons. Guess what? We have many more weapons. We have more modern weapons. We just don't choose to go around talking about them. Finland, a country of 5 million people, has the JASM missile. Poland has the JASM missile. There's nothing the Russians can do about the JASM. It's a super stealthy cruise missile. It can hit targets 1,500 kilometers inside Russia. The Finns have only issued 2 photographs of the JASM, both taken in America. But the Russians know they've got it. So we need to think about deterrence. We need to think, what do we do? How do we have escalation dominance? So if Russia does something, we immediately have an answer that gives the Russians an unpleasant experience. So I don't dispute we have work to do, but let's not, in terms of the global threats, Russia is not number one. If it's a country, it's China. If it's an issue, it's climate change.
Yeah, because I was thinking about the Lithuanian Russian community, because after we got our independence, there was kind of a thing like, we got away from the Russians, so now we demonized the Russians, and they got into their own communities, and they like Putin a lot. I think that they feel bullied because the whole Lithuanian approach to the thing, like all Russians are bad. So they got into their communities and they started, if we're being bullied, we're going to like another bully, but he's going to be one of ours.
Yeah.
how do we make a dialogue?
I think you need to, this is really a question for Lithuanians, and I think on principle as an outsider I should be very cautious about commenting on that. I think you've outlined a big aspect of the problem. One part of it is to ask, is there some outside influence going on here? Is this being stoked by Russian intelligence in some way? Is there anything we can do on that front? But national cohesion is really important. National cohesion is a national security question. And I think any country has to ask, as I said before, what are the divisions we have? Are they ethnic, linguistic, social, demographic, regional, economic, whatever? What can we do to make sure that those divisions don't get exploited by outsiders? What can we do to bring people together? And I think that's not just a question for Lithuania, but identifying the problem is the first stage towards trying to deal with it.
Lastly, what are the things that you like the most about how Lithuania has changed from the from when you were living here through our 19 years, through our independence?
Well, I think it's 29.
29, absolutely. Yeah. Through almost 30 years has passed. What are the best changes that you see in Lithuania?
I think there's many. And there's a whole chunk of stuff about life being more comfortable. You can use not only you can phone internationally. When I first came here, even making an international phone call was a big deal. You had to make an Užsakymas, phone up a number, they'll call you back. Yeah. So getting direct dial phone calls, the mobile technology, internet everywhere, these were huge obstacles back in the beginning. So I put those all under the broad heading of connectivity. I remember when I first, we used to queue. You could queue for 5 days just to cross the border over into Poland at Lesdinai and the other border crossing. So I think the growth of connectivity, Lithuania is profoundly connected with the outside world in every way, physically, electronically, culturally, socially. That's terrific. I think there's another thing is the generational change that I gave a lecture in Kaunas yesterday at the Sakharov Center. In the audience were kids 18, 19, 20. Not only did they have no memory of communism, their parents barely remember communism. Their parents were growing up in the 80s. They were never young pioneers. They didn't have to learn Marxism, Leninism at school. So we're kind of second generation into living in freedom. And I think that is really important. I think the self-confidence that brings is really important. Lithuania's never in its history been safer, better connected in the outside world, or more prosperous, and that's something to celebrate as we approach the anniversaries that are coming up. What worries me is the emigration. When I first came to Lithuania, it was a country of 3.7 million people. Now it's not quite 3 million, I think. That's partly the result of the death rate, people die too young. It's partly the result of a birth rate, people not having enough babies, and it's partly the result of emigration, people go and they don't come back. And I think if I had to identify one problem to deal with, it would be that.
Due to Brexit, do you think people will come back to Lithuania, the ones that are living there?
I mean, Britain isn't the only place that Lithuanians live
absolutely.
abroad.
Norway, Sweden.
And I've talked to many Lithuanians in Britain who say, if I can't stay in Britain, I'll move to Ireland, I'll move to Spain, move to some other country. So I have to say, I'm not sure Brexit's going to happen. I think it now seems clear that it's going to be postponed, and once it's postponed once, I think it can be postponed for longer, and then eventually we'll get a chance to change our mind and express that change of mind. But certainly the damage is considerable, and Britain will be poorer as a result. It may be less friendly for foreigners, and that may be reasons for people to leave. But I think this is fundamentally, I wouldn't look at the demand side as much as I look at the supply side. Why do people leave Lithuania? They leave partly because wages are better.
Better wages, yeah.
But not only. It's workplace relations, getting treated decently at work by your colleagues and by your bosses. That's a big difference when you go abroad. Public services, particularly in small towns and villages, public services are quite bad. Transport, education, health, that's bad. Access to justice, what do I do if things go wrong? Do I have redress? A sense of optimism about the future. Is this a place I want to bring my kids up? So I think it's not just the wages, all those things. And that is something that only Lithuanians can change. It won't change because of Brexit.
Thank you so very much for coming to the show. Thank you.
Okay.
This is my country, my damn country. Give me my country, you can keep the rest.